Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I'm the Research Chair and a Senior Fellow at the Center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It's a pleasure to welcome our speaker, Andrew Futter, a professor at the University of Leicester. His lecture is entitled Surviving the Third Nuclear Age. Andrew's talk explores the increasing dangers of the nuclear world, including greater geopolitical competition, rapid technological change, and the erosion of the bedrock of the global nuclear order, arms control, and norms. This lecture will explore the ways in which the international community can adapt to address and survive these threats. Andrew has written widely on a range of nuclear issues, including 3 recent books, Hacking the Bomb, The Politics of Nuclear Weapons, among others, and is also the author of a forthcoming book, The Global Third Nuclear Age, which is scheduled to be published in 2025. Man, Andrew, that is quite an impressive publication record. And this talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. Andrew will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll start the Q&A. During his talk, please feel free to raise your hand to get your questions in order and/or type questions into the chat while Andrew is speaking. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us here today, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rupal, for that introduction. Just going to check to see whether I can see my slides or whether, there we go. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for this, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me nice and early. It's about 5 o'clock here, so I've had plenty of time to prepare and get ready for things. And it's actually an incredibly nice day, which I know is an unusual thing as well. I was meant to give this talk a little while ago, and unfortunately we had to postpone it. But in some ways, that may be a good thing, because my ideas continue to evolve on this. And what I'm going to talk about today is a project, basically a culmination probably of about 10 years worth of work. So some of the other publications that Rupal very kindly mentioned have come out along the way. But what I'm trying to do with this project and with the book that will come out of this, that this talk is going to be based on, is try and bring some of these insights together. So I think probably along with a lot of people in your part of the world and in your institution, there's a feeling that the world is changing, probably for the worse rather than the better. But so far, it doesn't feel like anybody's really tried to stand back and think, well, what does this really mean? What are the different things that are going on? What are the global implications of some of this stuff? So I was lucky enough about 4 or 5 years ago to receive some funding from the European Research Council, and they, as you can see on the slide here, funded me for a project to explore this idea of the third nuclear age. And this started off as primarily being about the impact of technological change, new weapon systems, the whole information environment, and built in many ways on my previous work looking at cyber threats and nuclear weapons. But actually, as I conducted the work and as I went through it, it just became obvious that there were so many other interlinking parts that were part of this. The geopolitics, which I know you guys are very interested in, the normative breakdown, and even the kind of intellectual environment within which we think about nuclear weapons appears to me to be shifting. And I think importantly, it's shifting in different ways depending on where you are. Now, perhaps here in the UK, our views are similar to those of you guys and friends over in the US, but actually this may not be the same as in other parts of the world and for other actors, particularly those that don't necessarily have nuclear weapons. So it's trying to stand back and think about what all of this means. I should also point out that I've been incredibly lucky to, through the funding, to hire 5 excellent colleagues, 4 research assistants and 1 PhD student, who if you click on the link to the project, you can find out more about, and they've been absolutely essential in challenging and changing my ideas. So while I'm the one that gets to sort of say, here's some of the findings, they need to take a little bit of credit as well for all of this. And then I guess the final thing is, and this is not meant to be a spoiler in any way, but I don't have any simple, straightforward answers about how we survive the third nuclear age. I still think we're in the position where we have to understand what this means, and I still don't think we've quite got that right. So what I'm trying to do today is unpack what I think this third nuclear age, if indeed that's the right phrase for it, what that means, and what are the key things that we should be doing and thinking about, both as kind of us in the West, but actually as global citizens as well. So as Rupal said, I'll probably speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes to try and outline this. What I'm going to present is also broadly the chapters of the book, a different book to the one that Rupal mentioned, but a book that I hope to publish probably in about 18 months' time with Oxford University Press, which kind of maps all this stuff out. So I don't have all the answers. I'm really keen for you to engage. I'm really keen to push back on any of these thoughts. So please do feel free to do that. That's it. That's all. So this project utilizes the idea of nuclear ages. This is not a globally accepted way of thinking things, but it strikes me as being a really useful concept, and it's certainly something that in the Western world, and especially in and around the Washington Beltway, has had great traction, I think. So the idea is essentially that there is a use to try and break our nuclear history into different periods to help us think about what was particularly important at any one time and how this has changed. So there are a number of different ways you can do this. Classic historical accounts tend to split by US president. You might look in terms of the ebbs and flows of the Cold War and historical stuff. But this particular idea really struck me about trying to split nuclear history kind of based on the key focus within or the key geopolitical focus. What is it that's going on in the international system that we're all worried about? And then particularly, what is that hierarchy of risks? And this idea that developed in the 1990s, including with people such as Brad, it was the idea that after the Cold War, that the West or the world had somehow moved into a new era. That with the end of the Soviet Union, with the end of the sort of threat of mass arms racing, of a huge global nuclear exchange, and all of that business, that somehow the world had shifted. So this point of sort of 1990, 1991 is taken as a demarcation point in nuclear politics. Now, the idea is that the first nuclear age, broadly between 1945, 1990, 1991, was about those two main powers. Yes, there were other nuclear armed states, but actually they were kind of subservient to this central nuclear balance. And as I mentioned, we worried about arms racing, we worried about the threat of nuclear exchange, flashpoints such as Cuba or Berlin or other parts of the world as the Cold War went on. But the key point was it was about largely these two actors and their large nuclear stockpiles. And then, of course, with the end of the Cold War, there's a feeling that actually the threat hierarchy, not just in the West, but actually globally, begins to shift, where there's a slow growth of worries about rogue actors, particularly smaller regional recalcitrant states. North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, etc. And then, of course, after 9/11, a real focus on non-state actors gaining access to nuclear material or indeed a bomb. And this sort of gradually grew in the 1990s. And what we saw in the largely the Western debate, but actually the Western debate reflected, I think, broadly nuclear politics, or reflected nuclear politics more broadly, was this move from fears of war between nuclear armed states and major powers to these undeterrable, rogue, and irresponsible nuclear actors. And while we had a real focus on things like mutually assured destruction, the NPT, strategic stability, secure second strikes, in the second nuclear age, attention began to shift to thinking about how do we interdict? How do we stop? How do we counter proliferation? How do we stop before it happens? Both in terms of stopping supply, but also in terms of ballistic missile defenses, or in terms of precision options that might be used to undermine the capabilities of one of these actors. So the argument being that we have this big shift around the end of the Cold War where things change. Now, the argument that I would make is that over the last decade or so, things have begun to shift again. You can point to some pretty notable moments. I think 2014, Russia's first kind of invasion of Crimea and first proper interaction in Ukraine. The Trump administration's national security strategies pointing specifically to great power competition. You have the end of the INF Treaty, very symbolically. You have the end of the JCPOA. You have the rise of the TPNW, the ban treaty. So you have a lot of things that happen over the last 10 years that seem to kind of point to a world where things are shifting again. And actually, in the literature, you see less and less reference now to worries about nuclear security, and even actually to Iran and North Korea, certainly compared with 10 or 15 years ago. Now it is all about, as Brad and others at your organization have said, this 3 or 2-peer problem, the three great powers, that seems to have come to dominate. Now, I would argue that that the third nuclear age is a bit more than that, but I'll come on to that in a minute. The point being that the 2010s appear to be another demarcation point where global politics has shifted again. So that's broadly the idea and the temporalization of nuclear history that this idea puts forward. So there are pros and cons of this. I think it's quite useful to show a difference between a first and second nuclear age. It's important to see and map how threats and threat hierarchies shift. And I think that actually, if you don't break nuclear history up, then you miss something quite important. But on the flip side, this is clearly a very English-speaking, Anglo-centric, probably even inside the Washington Beltway view of nuclear history. So if you are sat in Jakarta or Pretoria or wherever, or Brasilia, wherever else, nuclear history may look quite different, and those demarcation points maybe aren't quite so pronounced as they are to us broadly in the West. So I think there's a slight limitation, although I think it just reflects the dominance of US and to a lesser extent Western European scholarship within this field. But it's not necessarily something that's insurmountable, as I'll come on to. I think my take on this is that while the nuclear age concept is a very useful way of framing stuff, I think in the past it's maybe been a bit too narrow. And I think it's been too narrow both in terms of this Western centrism. Again, not a surprise, because the US, particularly in the second nuclear age, is the dominant military player, but also actually intellectually as well in this field. But it's a spreading of the concept to include more actors, more types of dynamics, to look beyond, if you like, who had or who was seeking to have nuclear weapons, and indeed who was seeking to challenge the West. So I'll come on to that a little bit in a bit more. So I think what this comes down to is how we think about nuclear history and how we think about nuclear order, and making sure that we step outside of our comfort zone sometimes and try and analyze nuclear history, not just from our own particular perspectives, from that global perspective. And I think that's something that quite often gets missed here. And there are some works already out there that talk about a third nuclear age. Rhys Crilly's book there, which was published I think last year, 2 or 3 others, but they don't really treat the concept, or they don't they don't make it problematic in the way that I think we need to do, and really take it and think about what it means. So in a way, this is something I'm still working with. I think the nuclear age concept is a useful way of getting at what we're doing now, with the proviso that it has to be slightly expanded and slightly modified to capture what's going on today. Next slide, please, Katie. So I mentioned in the introduction that a key driver of all of this work has been my fascination, or a sort of morbid fascination with military technological progress. And this goes all the way back to my PhD thesis, which I wrote about US missile defense over a decade ago, and this interaction between technology and security. And that's kind of where this project came from. A belief that technological change, particularly in the United States, but actually proliferating and diffusing to other actors, was creating a suite of capabilities that weren't nuclear, but could have similar, if not effects, then at least carry out similar missions. And this was precision strike, it was missile defense, it was a whole host of other things that were coming out around about the same time. It was very much linked to the perceived requirements of the war on terror years, the perceived requirements of that shift to a second nuclear age, which I spoke about before. So this was where I started thinking, well, actually, this technological change is beginning to shift stuff. It may not be, but perhaps we never should have done, but perhaps we can't just focus on nuclear threats. We really need to think about this new intermediary set of capabilities that could interfere in nuclear missions as well. So this was kind of the underpinning of the project, and it was work that Ben Zala and I published, I think 2 or 3 years ago, in the European Journal of International Security. The idea really here is that everybody got really excited about technological progress. Everybody, and indeed now, seem to be speaking about AI can do this, quantum's going to change this, hypersonics mean this, cyber, etc., etc. And there was so much hype that was surrounded by this stuff, and often with actually very little understanding of what was really going on. And I think one of the first things I tried to do with this was to look back as well, to say, well, it does seem that something pretty substantial is happening here technologically, but there have been periods in the past where technological change has been destabilizing. Obviously, the invention of nuclear weapons, the invention of ICBMs, multiple warheads, stealth, the first missile defenses that are deployed, a whole host of things, sensors that might be able to find missiles, a whole host of things that have grown up over the years that at certain points have seemed to be very challenging. But it struck me that while there was a lot of hype and sometimes a lack of or misunderstanding of these technologies, when you took it all together, there was really something here. And I think the big difference for today from the past was really this point that there was lots of things happening at the same time. There were lots of things happening at the same time. They weren't all happening as they had previously in the West and the United States. There were other actors that were involved in this sort of thing. And importantly, a lot of the development was in non-nuclear and in some cases non-tangible and non-kinetic weapons, which marked, I think, a really different change from the past. So nevertheless, a lot of the literature, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, have been written about what I've referred to as the all-star cast. And some of these things are important, don't get me wrong. Artificial intelligence will impact across certainly the defense space. I'm not sure as much in the nuclear space, but could have certain applications in certain ways. Quantum, I think, is still a bit of a, we're not entirely sure what it would do, but the possible applications in terms of communications or sensing, particularly underwater, seem to be pretty significant. Hypersonics, again, strike me as something that, not the game changer that people say, but especially in the nuclear realm, but potentially quite significant when it comes to the conventional battlefield. And then the sort of the so-called new domains of cyber and space, which has effectively pushed nuclear operations, or the way we think about interaction and nuclear risks, into different fora. So I think some of the work that I've tried to do is unpack what each of these things might mean, and what becomes very clear is that it's really quite different for different actors. So different types of technological change may be more risky if you are, such as the UK, a state that relies on just submarines. It may be particularly risky if you have a very small land-based, non-mobile missile force. So there are different applications and there are different experiences of technological change if you look across the board. Nevertheless, I think there's a pretty strong literature about the fear that deterrence is, if not being transformed, then certainly being shaken by this. The question marks about stability, the question marks about possible arms racing, although possibly qualitatively rather than quantitatively. But I think what really struck me with this, and again, notwithstanding the fact that the sort of four or five things that I mentioned are important, is that the real technological shift is actually in most of the things that we're already doing, becoming better, diffusing to more actors, becoming quicker, becoming more capable. And the most obvious example there is in terms of longer and more precise versions of particular missiles, the spread of missile defenses, the ability to interfere in other people's systems in different ways, including in cyberspace. So actually, it was, if you like, the older stuff was just becoming more prominent and more significant. And in some ways, you could think of this as the revolution in military affairs of the 1990s, which was effectively a kind of tactical battlefield application of technology, has now risen up to the nuclear strategic level. And I think that might be a useful way of thinking about this stuff. So technology is important. Technology is at the heart, I think, of some of the challenges that we face today. It is clearly at the heart of the sort of the two-peer, three-power deterrence problem. But it's experienced differently by different actors. And I think that's quite an important thing to sort of pull out of this. The other thing that became very obvious at the start of this project was that technology doesn't explain everything. And perhaps that was a bit silly of me to think it would. But when I presented earlier versions of this work, I would always get but you can't understand this without looking at geopolitics. You can't understand technological progress, decisions about systems, doctrine, capabilities, etc., without looking at the politics, the rivalries, and the geopolitics that underpin it. And that's kind of that's one of the ways that the project began to expand. Next slide, please. And of course, thinking about technology leads very naturally to thinking about, well, what does this mean for deterrence? And again, this was a slightly more multifaceted than when I began this project, because it's quite different again for different actors. So clearly a key part of this third nuclear age thesis is the return of nuclear weapons. They never went away physically, but they perhaps went away slightly politically. Certainly in this country, perhaps to a lesser extent in the United States, maybe sort of simmered away in the background in others. But what we really have seen in the third nuclear age is the three major powers, and indeed most of the others, nuclear weapons are back. And even in my country here, there's been a move to increase the warhead stockpile. There seems to be a lot more interest in trying to make sure that we can actually replace the submarines that deliver the deterrent. And there's a real sort of debate about whether we're doing enough. So even here in the UK, there's a big debate about bringing all this back. And I guess that's a key point here, is that the third nuclear age will still be fundamentally about nuclear weapons, notwithstanding that technological change in different methods and means of deterring in non-nuclear weapons, in non-nuclear ways. Nuclear weapons, I think, will remain absolutely central. So this is a key part of it. But we've also seen quite conspicuously in Ukraine, but also in Pakistani doctrine and in some of the sort of the stuff coming out of North Korea, that tactical nuclear weapons, or battlefield, or substrategic, or whatever you want, whichever label you want to use, have made a pretty conspicuous return as well. And it seems to be linked in with kind of a breakdown in the norms or taboo around thinking about nuclear weapons as possible having a use in warfare. There's big debates about how serious Russian threats of nuclear weapons are in Ukraine, but it's clearly seen as an important part of coercion and trying to make us in the West and those supporters of Ukraine trying to believe that. For the Pakistanis and North Koreans, I think it's much more straightforward. They're faced by conventionally superior forces, and they see forward deployed smaller yield tactical forces as a key way to deter. And while this does hark back in some ways to NATO's strategy in the Cold War, it marks, I think, a real difference and real shift from what we saw in the second nuclear age. And I think there's an interesting question about where NATO fits in with this, with debates and discussions about whether the 100, 150 DCA forward deployed aircraft and the B-61s in Europe represent a significant, a substantial or a sufficient forward deployed nuclear deterrent force going forward. So that's, if you like, the kind of the stuff that has always been there but may have returned with more prominence. And then you have, and this links back to the technology slide, this rise of what Ben and I called strategic non-nuclear weapons and strategic non-nuclear deterrence. And when we started this project, we felt that this was something that was a very US-centric thing, because the US has the money, has the technology, is often qualitatively ahead of everybody else. But actually, it seemed quite a few other actors were really interested in this as a way of deterring. And it's what, on my table on that slide, we refer to as the technological transformers. So there are a number of countries now, a number of states and governments and experts and military leaders that see a real value for deterring nuclear threats through non-nuclear means. The South Koreans, the Israelis, Japanese, Australians, so on, they're not all doing exactly the same stuff, but have massive interest in precision conventional capabilities of all sorts of guises, both in terms of offense and defense, as a means of managing their immediate nuclear armed rivals. Now, each of those states in different ways has a nuclear guarantee, whether it be extended, whether it be undeclared, or whether it be through a sort of an alliance type relationship in the case of Taiwan. But nevertheless, it's interesting, I think, that the third nuclear age has seen some states pushing or returning to the nuclear toolkit, but either in terms of strategic or tactical deterrence. But at the same time, we have the rise of these other states, which, while not necessarily eschewing nuclear deterrence, are trying to find a different way to manage those risks. One, perhaps for some of those countries, that's politically more viable, but also one that I think maybe is seen as being quite useful in terms of meeting those immediate nuclear risks. So what we've begun to set out, and in the book that Rupal kindly mentioned at the start, we've put together a case of 20, a book of 20 case studies trying to look at how different actors are responding in this realm. And we make the case that at least 5 or 6 states are responding through advanced conventional means to nuclear threats, which I think is a bit of a challenge to this logic that states will always go nuclear in the face of a nuclear armed adversary. Not to say that any of those states in the bottom right hand corner would not go nuclear in the future at some point, but that for the moment the direction of travel is conventional, and is arguably about conventional war, conventional deterrence rather than nuclear. So what this does also suggest, if we map out some very different thinking and pathways in terms of deterrence and the role of nuclear weapons and strategic non-nuclear weapons, is that it begins to cloud again what we think about stability, what we think about deterrence balances, the possibility for escalation, entanglement, and a whole host of other things. So that is work that I know others are doing, of thinking about how entanglement of conventional and nuclear systems, entanglement of space-based early warning, and a whole host of other things around that. But I think it's something that we're still not quite sure about. And my feeling is that what we think we thought about escalation, crisis management, red lines in the past may well be quite different. And part of the reason for that is, if you start thinking, particularly with the sort of tactical nuclear weapons and strategic non-nuclear weapons aspect, these may be seen as somehow more usable or more viable in certain situations. And that, I think, begins to shift the way we think about the permissibility of nuclear use, and indeed the possibility of war under the nuclear shadow. I also think there are some mixed messages for proliferation in the third nuclear age that come from this as well. I think there's been a strong belief that nuclear weapons are the only real way to go if you're faced by an existential threat. But maybe that might be shifting in the third nuclear age, that actually there is a viable pathway through conventional weaponry and conventional deterrence, possibly in addition to a strong guarantee from one of the major powers. But I think that shifts the way we look at proliferation, and I think that could be an important component of the third nuclear age too. Next slide, please, Katie. So this is the bit where I sort of mentioned at the start that the project was always about technology. It was always about how technology interacted with deterrence and crisis management and all of those things. But what became very clear early on was that you just cannot understand this without the broader geopolitical framework. And I know, again, that Brad and others, where you are, have theorized this idea of the two-peer problem, and that's become a very prominent idea in the US and within the policy debate. This idea that the United States, for the first time ever, is faced by two nuclear peer competitors, and if the concerns about what China may do prove to be correct, then actually two peer competitors with more nuclear weapons in total than the United States might have. Presenting a big challenge for a force that historically has been quite constrained, not least by arms control. So I think that is absolutely fundamental. I think that's a key part of this third nuclear age. It's the return to great power competition. It's the return of great power politics as well, which I think is a slightly broader concept that comes out of it. And it encompasses a lot of the things that I mentioned there about deterrence balances and deterrence, shifting nature of deterrence and the way the different capabilities might be used for certain missions, and the permissibility, again, of carrying out certain types of actions. But I think the two-peer problem, while it is central and it is important and impacts us globally, is only really part of what we're looking at and what is going on. And I think that's because it masks a number of important other actors or number of other dynamics that are going on, perhaps at a slightly lower level. And one of the things that I always point to this, and it's not a deterrence peer problem for us in the West or the United States, but India is an increasingly significant pole within the nuclear order. There's question marks whether you would call India a great power yet, but there's certainly a possibility that could be the trajectory that we move towards. And India is becoming more influential in certain different ways. You only have to, depending on how much you read into the story, that Modi may have been influential on some of Putin's decisions around nuclear weapons. I don't know how much I buy that, but the fact that Modi is even in that discussion, I think, is quite significant. India is also a country that the United States has been trying to court for a long time, but India is as far as I can see, is a country that is quite keen to remain independent as much as possible. But I think is increasingly part of what I would call a four-power structure of the third nuclear age, a four-power, great power political structure. And again, I think it's just moving beyond that focus on deterrence, focusing on the two peers that are challenging us in the West, to think about another actor as well. A second line, or if you like, a second concentric circle, is what this shift from an era of US primacy, or what I've termed here is Pax, nuclear Americana, is what this means for a whole host of middle powers and other actors. Now, there were big concerns in Europe about US possible disengagement with the previous president, and I don't think they've really gone away. I think there's a real fear in this region. I think it's replicated in others, about what a reduction, or at least a less willingness to engage in different parts of the world might mean for the security of Europeans, states across the Asia Pacific, and indeed others as well. And I think that's important, because I think that's part of this bigger challenge, that while as we move beyond a period of US pretty much unrivaled primacy to one where it's being challenged, it has these two competitors, that begins to shape decisions in capitals in other parts of the world, in London, in Berlin, in Paris, in Tokyo, in Canberra, in a whole host of different places. And so I think the first challenge there is what this means for alliances, alliance credibility, and the choices of statespeople within those countries. And that's a pretty vibrant ongoing debate here in Europe at the moment, I think, about what if any changes might need to happen in European security after the next election. And I'm pretty sure it's happening in other parts of the world as well. A kind of a third part of this is that you have some sort of, if you like, regional middle powers such as Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and others, that are becoming quite influential in this space as well. So particularly in terms of their link with the non-aligned movement, but particularly in terms of their link with other states who are not necessarily leaning in one particular direction, but just seeking to balance and seeking not necessarily really strong links with any of the major powers. So you have, if you like, the rise again of middle powers that have not the same ability to shape the system, but can be quite awkward and actually are going to be important in co-opting when you think about nuclear order. And it's no coincidence that some of these powers have also been very very significant in the Humanitarian Impacts Initiative and in the treaty of the Nuclear Ban Treaty. So I think working with these states that have now perhaps got slightly more autonomy because the system is shifting, is becoming more multipolar, is another challenge that perhaps doesn't quite get caught in this two-peer problem. And I suppose as an addendum to that, one particularly interesting aspect for the third nuclear age is the importance of civilian nuclear power. So for large parts of the Cold War, this was a key Western, US, French, and other led thing. Today, it's the Russians and Chinese that are really pushing, that are selling, that are making deals with countries in other parts of the world that want access to nuclear technology for non-weapons purposes. And I think that's an important dynamic as well. That kind of market, that share, the influence that comes with controlling that is quite significant too. So I guess what I'm trying to get at with this great power nuclear politics slide is that the third nuclear age is not going to be just about three nuclear armed powers and the deterrence relationships between them. There's actually a number of other dynamics that are going on as well. Now, you could argue that these aren't as immediately important in terms of nuclear war, but I would say that they are important in terms of how we construct the world or how we think about the nuclear politics within which the world is playing out. And I think the final bit of this, and one thing that my thinking has really developed throughout this project, courtesy of a couple of excellent team members that I've had, is really trying to think about what this means in the global south or the global middle or whatever phrase you want to use. But basically in those parts of the world that don't have nuclear weapons, don't appear to have any interest in nuclear weapons, but do quite often have significant development needs and definitely do not want to be impacted by nuclear use in another part of the world. And I think that's been key to this idea that we've got a new nuclear globalization in the way that lots of different actors are now becoming more vocal, or at least being heard in ways that perhaps they weren't before. And I think one of the challenges for us in the West, and certainly for the UK, US, and something that really struck me, was that there just hasn't been anywhere near the same level of kind of criticism and condemnation from certain influential actors in parts of the global south to what's happened in Ukraine, particularly the nuclear posturing and thinly veiled threats, as perhaps we might have expected. And I think that's been a bit of a wake-up call that this is no longer a global order where you can just rely on certain partners, or at least hope that they will broadly toe the line with whatever you think. So the third nuclear age is important in terms of it's that shift, not just from US unipolarity and, if you like, this Pax Nuclear Americana, but this rise of different actors and their ability to shape international politics, not always in the ways perhaps that we or the US or the West would necessarily want. Next slide, please. So I don't know how many of you lived in or spent time in the UK in the 1980s, but there was a TV program for British Telecom hosted by this guy in the top right-hand corner called Bob Hoskins, and it's always stuck in my mind. And his catchphrase was always, "It's good to talk." And while that's kind of a bit of fun, the broader point is actually quite significant. So it strikes me that this nuclear era, third nuclear age that we're moving into, is defined pretty much by people not wanting to talk. And that's happening at all sorts of different levels. They're not wanting to engage. There's less room for grey area. There's less room to sit in a room and disagree with people. And what I think we increasingly see is either echo chambers or talking past each other. Now, there may be a lot of good intentions that underpin this that never materialise. But that's something that struck me as someone who's lucky enough to have a kind of a foot in the deterrence camp in the policy world, but also one in the academic world and links, or at least involvement with and links with a lot of disarmament and non-proliferation groupings as well, is that actually this world is becoming more split. And I think this is happening across a number of different levels. So the most obvious one, it's not cliche, but it's the one that everyone points to, is that we're having the arms control project that began 60 years ago is beginning to unravel. The kind of start ideas, the bilateral frameworks for a lot of how we thought about nuclear arms control is beginning to fall apart. And I don't need to go through all the different things that have happened, but a lot of things that have happened in the last 5 or 6 years, or perhaps slightly longer than that, have been really significant, and arguably can be traced back to the end of the ABM treaty 20 years ago. And I think from the current standpoint, it doesn't look particularly likely that we're going to return to that type of arms control, at least not for a little while. There may well be opportunities with Russia, depending on what happens at the end of Ukraine. It's hard to see why China would want to engage in arms control from the current standpoint until it gets to a point where it believes it might be viable. And in other parts of the world, this doesn't seem to really be part of the political picture either. So the concern about the bilateral arms control framework that was built up painstakingly over a number of years seems to be on its way out. Doesn't mean that it can't be replaced by something else, but at the moment it doesn't look particularly likely that that will happen. And then the sort of the attendant thing with that is something that many have warned me about, is that as you lose these treaties and the frameworks and the kind of the dialogue and engagement, you also begin to lose the people that understand how it works. So if you do get back to this point, it becomes increasingly difficult to actually set up arms control and have that institutional knowledge that allows you to do it. Now, we may not quite be at that point yet, but that does seem to be something in the medium term that could become a pretty serious concern. The second point is a gradual fracturing of international frameworks and norms in terms of the norm stuff. Going back to the threats that have been issued around Ukraine, just seem that there seems to be a level of acceptance of that in different parts of the world. There doesn't seem to be as much condemnation as we might have thought. But also there's this sort of ongoing concern about, of course, most recently with the PrEPCon, but where the NPT goes, the talk in certain places of returning to nuclear testing, a whole host of things that surround that. So it's like this kind of the broader framework that was built up quite often by people in the United States over a number of years seems to me to be falling away slightly as well. Which is not to say that the NPT goes tomorrow. I think the number of states still see a value in keeping it, but that it's becoming more and more difficult, I think, in this era where there's other pressures to balance that with Article 6 commitments and with the expectations of many of the other states, many of the non-nuclear armed states that are part of that. And of course, one may argue that a direct product of that has been the ban treaty, the TPMW, and this kind of different narrative and growth of a real push or revival in disarmament activism, particularly I think in Europe, but perhaps slightly in other parts of the world as well, that has culminated in this nuclear ban treaty. And while I don't see the nuclear ban treaty changing nuclear politics overnight for the obvious reasons that I'm sure you're all aware of, it's a pretty significant symbolic moment, I think, of showing that, well, actually we're increasingly or large parts of the world are increasingly frustrated with what goes on with nuclear weapons that they have little control about, and the frameworks that have been set up to do this, that they see that they need to go in different directions. So I think it is significant in that way. It's also significant because, going back to one of my earlier points, marginalized voices are becoming heard, or at least voices that weren't heard in the past are becoming more prominent. Those in terms of victims of nuclear testing, those who feel that perhaps they haven't had the benefits of nuclear technology, that it's been constrained, often under a sort of broader non-proliferation or Western non-proliferation framework, and a whole host of other things that have come out of this as well. And I think one of the fourth point here, and it brings some of this together because there's some quite close links with the TPNW and narratives, is the sort of re-emergence or growth of the non-governmental organisation and almost pressure group community again. Now, of course, this isn't new. This has been around in the past in various different ways, but it seems to have become almost like an industry today, where there's lots and lots of different groups that are all committed to this, and that has, I think, helped to amplify some of the voices and amplify the concerns, and was a key part of the whole humanitarian stroke TPNW process as well. I'm still not entirely sure that this is always particularly helpful. I think what it's led to, or is part of, is point 5, which is the kind of this split between, if you like, deterrence studies, or those very much wedded to the idea of deterrence and indeed nuclear weapons, and those that cannot see a future with nuclear weapons, believe disarmament has to happen as soon as possible, or right away, and are linked in with this broader in the academy idea of critical nuclear studies. So I think one of the things that I've seen is that a lot of meetings are becoming echo chambers, and Doug Shaw, I don't know if Doug's on the call, but at a previous talk made this excellent point, and I've shamelessly nicked it off him, but there's this increasing tendency in nuclear politics, and I don't know if this is true at the government level, but it's certainly true in my world, of excluding voices rather than defeating arguments, and I think that's really important. It's something that either side of this debate is perhaps not doing to the extent it should, but it's also because the grey area in between, the ability to disagree, the ability to try and understand each other, seems to be going. So when I said at the start about how this whole world, it's not just about technology, it's not just about politics, it's about the intellectual framework within which we're acting in. I think this is where it's coming from, this inability to try and find compromise, no matter how difficult it is, and the fact that this is happening right from the very top, right out to the, if you like, very broad and societal level as well. Next slide, please. And then this is the final substantive slide, and this is, again, broadening out even further, perhaps, and one may even argue that this concept, that the danger here is that the third nuclear age concept becomes so broad that it's just about everything, and that's not an unreasonable argument. But I think it is important that this is the first kind of nuclear age or period of nuclear history where I think we've really started to think about how other risks are interconnected with nukes. And again, that framing of first and second nuclear age was very much about weapons, deterrence, war. Yes, there was nuclear winter. Yes, there was, the civil applications aspect that came around this. But I think ours is the first generation, or at least this is the first generation, where we're really starting to think about how things are connected. And the first part of this is a societal thing. I think over the last 20 years, particularly in the West, definitely in the UK, probably also in the US, maybe in Europe as well, we just kind of forgot about nuclear risks. From the 1980s, where if you speak to people that were around in the 1980s, that they will remember, the real fears of nuclear war in 1983. They probably remember some sort of civil defense type planning. There was a real engagement with it on all sorts of different levels. And this kind of dropped away and was replaced by fears of a whole host of other things during the intermediate years. And of course, most recently, global communicable disease, but also prominently, I think, climate change as well. So we kind of forgot about nukes. And my theory on this is that part of that is, and I don't know which one necessarily comes first, but it kind of disappears from the mainstream of culture. So in the 1980s, you have all of these apocalyptic films that tell you, and it's right at the forefront of everybody's mind. And while it shifted a little bit with terrorism and various different, Hollywood blockbusters that were worried about nukes being smuggled into ports during the 90s and 2000s, this kind of threat of major nuclear use sort of went away a little bit. Now, what you could argue we've seen is a slight return with all the Oppenheimer, with Fallout, with other things. So maybe this return of nuclear culture is signaling that we're beginning to think about and engage as a society with nuclear risks again. But I think the important bit is that kind of disappeared, at least in my mind. And again, please push back. But that kind of disappeared for a generation, and that lack of engagement, I think, is quite significant in terms of where we are now. The other thing, and I've alluded to this a little bit already in the talk, but the fact that nuclear technologies are viewed very differently by some in other parts of the world, and are seen increasingly as a way to development and or sometimes to meet net zero gains as well, possibly with more emphasis on the first. And if we are to see a significant expansion of particularly nuclear power plants, but nuclear applications in different ways as well across the globe, this obviously brings with it a whole host of proliferation questions, but actually has this really interesting set of linkages between climate and nuclear as well. And again, others have done fabulous work about how changes in the climate may threaten particular installations. One could look and think about what rising sea levels might do for the submarine base in Faslane in the UK, for example, but there's a whole host of other examples you could use. But also, of course, the other flip as well, that the nuclear threats to climate are much more well-established or much more well-trodden path about what the effects of nuclear use would be on the climate in different ways. So I think unpacking this nexus between development, climate change, the spread of nuclear technology, possibly in relation to sustainable development goals as well, is going to be a really important part of this new nuclear age, and perhaps, again, something that's slightly different from what came before. I also see in this country, and speaking with other people, there's questions about what civil defense might look like, or at least emergency preparation planning for nuclear use. And I think, unfortunately, in this country, the sort of public response to COVID might give a bit of an indication of how difficult this will be. The whole idea is, again, as many will know, of civil defence was basically shelved in the UK 60 years ago. Certainly the idea of everybody having a bunker and everybody having all the other things that you need to survive it under a nuclear attack. But it does seem that this is coming back. and it's a mixture of things. It's the physical things you do to prepare in terms of what do you actually build, what programs and things do you put in place, but also it's the intellectual thing. How much information do you give to people without scaring them, without worrying them? And again, what's happened in Ukraine has brought this absolutely back to the forefront of people's minds in the UK, that actually, yeah, nuclear weapons exist. There are people out there that might do nasty things to this country, and this raises some pretty nasty or pretty difficult questions about what happens if we are victim of a nuclear strike. So I think this isn't entirely fleshed out yet, but I think this link again with ideas of civil defence, what is expected of a government, particularly in a democratic society, to do in this space, and the fact that most of these things are incredibly expensive, is a difficult but probably a very important debate that we need to have. And then finally, this kind of goes back to the first point, and again using Ukraine as an example. I was approached to do quite a lot of media work when the first sort of tranche of Russian threats came out around Ukraine. Some of them specifically mentioned the UK, and I think there was stuff on TV about a tsunami that would come over and demolish London, a whole host of things. And I was kind of astounded by the lack of understanding amongst quite senior and high-profile journalists about this. And I use this as an example. And I won't say who it was, but this idea of, but surely we'll shoot down these missiles with our missile defense, with our nuclear defense system. And to which you'd say, well, what system? That's not how it works. We have a deterrent, we have a nuclear, but that doesn't shoot things down. That's not what it's all about. So even at that very basic level, I think a knowledge of what the nuclear world means, how real it is, and kind of the realities of what the UK, the US, others can and can't do. So again, it's this sort of re-educating ourselves and reacquainting ourselves with the grammar and understanding of deterrence and nuclear weapons. And while I give that example as a sort of more general one, I also think it's true in official and government circles as well, where we've just elected a new government in this country, and there are a lot of people, possibly even in the cabinet, who are quite young, who don't have a lot of government experience, that probably aren't that familiar with a lot of these issues, perhaps as a generation before would have been. And I think that's quite an important challenge, to make sure that everyone is up to speed and understands these things. So this broader risk environment within which we're acting, I think, is significant. And then finally, Katie, one more slide, please. So bringing this all together and trying to think about what it means. These are, if you like, the sort of main takeaways and where I am at the moment. So you could challenge the idea of nuclear ages, and I think there's a case to be made for that. But it seems to me to be a pretty powerful construct and a pretty good way of getting at the fact that our nuclear world is changing, and that we are in a different place than we were 20 years ago. Whether that be in a very Western-centric view or whether it be a global view, the world is changing. This is a framework, especially I think if expanded, that allows us to make the case that something has changed and that we need to possibly even think about this differently. EDTs, emerging disruptive tech, clearly is a part of this. It's different for different actors. It has different implications and applications depending on deterrence postures, your force, what you're trying to do. But nevertheless, I think this is something that's not going away. It's something that is shifting the way we think about the ways, ends and means of deterrence, and indeed shifting the way we think about procurement and a whole host of other things as well. And the fact that several states are already thinking in terms of advanced or strategic non-nuclear deterrence as a means to deter nuclear adversaries is pretty significant. This idea of nuclear globalization, I think, links in with a slow, if not death, then erosion of a period of US dominance. The kind of nuclear hegemony or the ability to shape the nuclear world that the US and the West had over the last 20 years is eroding, and it's changing. That's partly due to the two-peer deterrence problem. It's partly due to these whole host of other geopolitical dynamics that I laid out as well. Nukes still seem to remain pretty central to everything in the third nuclear age, but it's becoming more complex. We have this idea of, or the phrase that's used as newtopia, the fact that we have to now re-engage again with the likelihood of a real demand for civilian nuclear technology across the world, potentially in parts of the world where we may view it as being unstable, or possibly that might become involved in conflict, and that raises a whole host of questions that we need to need to think about too. The good to talk point, we don't seem to be talking across divisions very much anymore, whether that be in official levels or whether that be more broadly in this, what I've termed as, if you like, nuclear culture wars between how we think about stuff. And then this final point, that nuclear risks are becoming more enmeshed in a much bigger, wider risk society. And I think understanding those linkages and unpacking that is really central. And again, perhaps that's always been there, but perhaps has not been as prominent in the literature, and certainly not in the nuclear ages literature. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully I haven't gone on too long, and I look forward to some questions.